3 months after my stroke, the man I shared my life with looked at me and said I was not fit to stand by his side, not fit to be seen in front of others. And in that moment I felt the ground shift beneath me, because the person I had supported through every season of his life now saw me as a burden. Yet I knew deep inside that his words would not be the end of my story. Thank you for watching my story. It means so much to me. And before I go further, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please leave me a comment and let me know. My name is Daniela. I was born and raised here in the United States, and I have lived a long life filled with hard work, sacrifice, and more lessons than I can count. I grew up believing in the value of family, believing that when you stand by someone through their struggles, they will stand by you when your own storms arrive. I worked from the time I was young, building not just a career but a reputation for being steady, determined, and unafraid to do what others said a woman could not do. I remember the pride I felt when I became the first woman in my state to manage regional operations, a role that came with long hours, countless challenges, but also the respect of people who knew I had earned every bit of it. Life was not always easy, but I never complained because I believed my strength would one day be the foundation for a family who could stand tall together. And for many years I thought I was right because I gave everything I had to my husband, supported his career, stood beside him at every company event, and held his hand when he doubted himself. I thought we were a team. I thought we were building a life that honored both of us. But illness has a way of showing you the truth about those closest to you. When I had my stroke, my body slowed down, my steps were unsteady, and my face no longer held the same glow of youth, but my heart, my mind, and my love remained the same. And yet in his eyes I began to see not gratitude for all I had given, but shame, as if my weakness was an inconvenience that he wished to hide. I want you to understand that before the stroke my life was not perfect, but it was full of purpose, and I carried myself with pride, because I had always been someone who others could depend on. Whether it was in my work, in my home, or in my marriage, I gave every ounce of strength I had to keep things moving forward. When the stroke came, it felt like my body had betrayed me. One morning I was standing strong, and the next I was trapped in a body that refused to obey the commands I gave it. I had to learn how to move again, how to hold a cup without spilling, how to steady my legs when I took even the smallest step. For months I pushed through therapy, swallowing the pain, and even though progress was slow, I celebrated every little victory because I knew what it took to walk again. After 3 months, I was no longer trapped in bed. I was walking, not gracefully, but with courage. Each step a reminder that I was still alive and still capable of rising. I believed in my heart that my husband would see this effort and be proud, that he would look at me and see, not weakness, but strength. The kind of strength that once drew him to me, the strength he leaned on when he doubted himself. And yet instead of pride, I found only silence. Instead of encouragement, I felt his distance growing. That distance became clearer as the date of his company Gala drew near, a night that had once been so special to us. A night we would dress together in our best clothes and walk into the grand hall side by side, smiling at friends and colleagues who admired the couple we used to be. I still remember how he used to beam with pride when people congratulated him for having me by his side. He would squeeze my hand and whisper that he could not have done it without me. Those memories still warmed me, but they also made the present feel like a knife slowly pressing into my chest. Because, as the invitations went out and the preparations began, I realized he had not once asked if I was ready to go, not once offered to help me find a dress or choose a pair of shoes, not once spoke of us walking in together as we always had. So one evening, with my heart pounding and my courage trembling, I asked him if he still wanted me by his side at the gala. I expected him to at least soften his voice, to hesitate, but instead he looked at me with cold eyes and said words I will never forget, that I would make people uncomfortable, that they would pity us, as though my presence would stain his image. It was in that moment that the years of love, sacrifice, and loyalty I had given felt invisible, swept aside as though they no longer mattered. I nodded. I turned back to my cup of tea, but inside I was unraveling. because the man I had trusted to hold my hand through sickness had decided to drop it when I needed him most. And yet, as painful as it was, I kept my silence, for I have learned in my long life that sometimes silence is not weakness. It is the beginning of a strength the other person never expects. The days that followed his words were some of the heaviest I had ever carried. Because it was not just about a gala, it was about realizing that the man who once swore to honor me in sickness and in health now saw my sickness as something to hide, as though my presence would diminish his standing in the eyes of others. I moved quietly around the house, not wanting to invite another remark that would cut me down, but inside I replayed his words over and over, and each time they struck me, I felt another piece of my heart splinter. I thought of the nights I sat in hospital corridors waiting for him when his health faltered years ago. I thought of the dinners I hosted for his colleagues so he could impress them. I thought of the countless times I put my own ambitions aside so his could shine. And it became painfully clear that my sacrifices had become invisible to him. Still, I did not argue. I did not shout. Because what good are loud words to a heart that has already decided you are less than? And yet, in the middle of my quiet despair, something unexpected happened. Something that reminded me that even when those closest to you turn cold, there are still people who see you. It was a weekday afternoon when there was a knock at my door. And when I opened it, I found the CEO's wife standing there, holding a pot of soup and smiling at me with a warmth I had not felt in weeks. She had heard of my stroke, she said, and wanted to check in to see how I was doing. I invited her inside, and we sat together at my kitchen table, the same table where my husband had dismissed me. But this time it was filled with the sound of kindness. As I spoke to her, I told her about the hard days, about the work it took just to regain balance, about the loneliness that followed when the man I trusted most grew distant. Her eyes never left mine, and in that gaze I saw no pity, no discomfort, only respect. She asked about my life before all this, and I found myself sharing stories I had not spoken of in years. Stories of the long hours, the battles I fought to break barriers, and how I had once been the first woman in the state to manage regional operations. I saw her expression change, a mixture of surprise and admiration, because she realized that the woman sitting before her was not just a frail body recovering from a stroke, but someone who had carried strength, vision, and legacy long before illness came. For the first time in months, I felt my spirit rise a little, because I was reminded that my story was not over, and that someone who barely knew me could still see what the man in my own home had chosen to forget. When she left that day, promising to return soon, I stood by the door a little longer, holding the scent of her kindness in the air, and I whispered to myself that maybe I was not as invisible as I had begun to feel. It was a small light in a very dark season. But sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you that dignity and worth do not disappear simply because someone else refuses to acknowledge them. After that visit, I found myself thinking differently. Because for weeks I had been shrinking into myself, letting my husband's words echo so loudly that they drowned out my own voice. But now there was another sound, the memory of someone who reminded me that I was more than my limp, more than my slowed steps, more than the label of being unfit. Still, the silence in my home grew heavier as the gala approached. I would watch him polish his shoes, adjust his cufflinks, and check his watch, preparing himself for an evening he believed belonged only to him, and not once did he glance at me as though I could still belong by his side. I wanted to ask again. I wanted to remind him of the years when I stood beside him proudly, but I held my tongue because of his answer, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me beg for a place in a life I had helped him build. I will never forget the morning I went to the closet and opened the box that held my old gala dress, the royal blue silk that once made me feel like I was part of the stars themselves. And as I brushed my hand across the fabric, I felt a sting in my chest. I remembered how proud I used to feel wearing it, how he once looked at me as though I was the crown he wore into every room, but now I stood there alone, wondering if I would ever wear it again. I closed the box quietly and pushed it back into the shadows, but I carried that ache with me the rest of the day. It was not vanity. It was not about being seen in a pretty dress. It was about being recognized as the woman who had given half her life to help another man shine. And as the days drew closer, his words still lingered. Words that told me I would make people uncomfortable. Words that made me feel like my efforts to walk again, to smile again, to live again, were nothing more than inconveniences to him. But I reminded myself each morning, as I practiced my steps, gripping my cane and forcing one foot in front of the other, that every small victory mattered, even if he could not see it. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to sink into the chair and stay there. But I pushed forward, because I knew that strength is not measured by how quickly you move, but by how deeply you refuse to stop. So while he moved around the house, confident in his decision to walk into that gala alone, I carried another decision quietly in my heart. I would not let his rejection be the final word over my life. I would not let his shame bury my story. What he did not know was that outside of his narrow view, someone else had seen me. Someone else had recognized that my worth had not vanished with my stroke. And though I did not yet know exactly what would come from it, I could feel that change was moving toward me. Like a tide, I could not stop. And in that quiet strength, I began to rise again. Not with anger, but with a determination he would never expect. It was just 3 days before the gala when the phone rang, and I almost did not answer it because I had grown used to silence and small conversations that carried no warmth. But something in me urged me to lift the receiver. I will never forget the voice on the other end, steady, respectful, and warm. It was the CEO himself. The man at the very top of the company where my husband worked, and his words washed over me like a light cutting through the dark. He told me that his wife had spoken to him about our conversation, about my years of work, about the barriers I had broken long before I was ever seen as just someone's wife. And he said, "We would be honored if you would attend the gala, not just as a guest, but as our guest of honor." For a moment I could not even breathe. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he would hear it through the line. And then the tears came, not of weakness, but of release. Because after all the weeks of feeling invisible, someone had seen me again. I thanked him, my voice trembling, and when I hung up the phone, I sat in my chair for a long time, holding the moment in my hands as though it was a fragile glass I did not want to drop. My husband was in the next room, unaware that the very event he wanted me hidden from had just become the stage where I would be honored, and I felt something stirring inside me that had been buried for too long. The quiet power of dignity returning. I rose from my chair slowly, leaning on my cane, and I walked toward the closet once more. Only this time, I did not push the box back into the shadows. I pulled out the dress, the royal blue silk, and I laid it across the bed, smoothing every crease with careful hands. And as I looked at it, I whispered to myself that I was still worthy of being seen, worthy of being celebrated, worthy of standing in a room filled with people who would not measure me by the limp in my step, but by the strength in my story. That night, as I prepared for bed, I thought of all the years I had stood silently behind my husband, clapping when he was praised, smiling when he was honored, and yet this time, the invitation was not his to offer or deny. It was given directly to me. I carried that thought with me as I closed my eyes, and for the first time since my stroke, I slept without the weight of shame pressing against my chest. In the morning, I began to prepare in ways he could not see. Because I chose not to tell him. I chose to let the moment come to life on its own. To let the surprise show him that no matter how hard he tried to diminish me, the truth of who I was could not be erased. I practiced my steps with renewed determination. I tried on my shoes to see if they still carried me with grace. I set aside my jewelry, simple but meaningful, and I rehearsed in my heart what it would feel like to walk into that grand hall once more. Not as a discarded wife, but as a woman remembered and respected. I did not need revenge. I did not need to argue. All I needed was to show up and let my presence speak louder than anything he had ever said about me. And in that moment, I knew that what awaited me at the gala was not just a night out, but a reclaiming of everything I thought I had lost. And I promised myself that when I stepped through those doors, I would not bow my head in shame. I would lift it high, even if every step shook beneath me. The days that followed that call felt different, as though the air itself carried a new kind of strength, because for the first time since my stroke, I was no longer bracing myself for rejection. I was preparing myself for recognition, and that shift gave me a courage I had almost forgotten I had. Each morning I rose earlier, determined to practice my steps around the house, moving from the kitchen to the living room, then back again, gripping my cane not as a crutch, but as a partner in my recovery. I could feel my body straining, my muscles trembling, but with each step I whispered to myself that I was not broken. I was rebuilding, and there was dignity in the effort alone. At night, I would sit quietly with the royal blue silk dress draped across my lap, my fingers tracing the fabric as though it was an old friend. Remembering the nights it once carried me into rooms filled with music and laughter, and I told myself that this time it would carry me again. Not as someone's shadow, but as someone's story. I made small preparations in silence, tucking away pieces of myself he had long stopped noticing, choosing the shoes that would balance me best, setting aside the necklace that once made me feel like a woman of grace, and not just a patient in recovery. I stood before the mirror more than once, studying the lines of my face, the faint marks of illness that I could not erase. And instead of pity, I forced myself to see the strength written there, the proof that I had survived what many could not. For years my husband had told his colleagues about my strength, about how I had stood by him through hard times, but now he could not even bear to stand beside me when my body slowed, and I thought to myself how strange it is that strangers can honor what those closest to you refuse to see. 3 nights before the gala, I decided that I would not tell him. Not a word about the invitation, not a hint about the honor being prepared for me, because sometimes silence carries more power than confrontation. Let him walk into that hall believing he was the one who deserved to be admired. Let him sip his drink with confidence while speaking to colleagues. Let him smile as though the night was his alone, and then let the truth arrive in a form he could never control. The truth of me walking through those doors not as the woman he pitied, but as the woman they celebrated. That thought steadied me. It gave me peace in a way anger never could, because I knew that soon his words would no longer echo as the final sentence over my life. On the night before the gala, I laid everything out: the dress, the shoes, the jewelry, even the small handbag that had been waiting in the back of the closet for years. I touched each item slowly, not with vanity, but with reverence, as though preparing a part of myself to rise again after being buried in silence. I prayed quietly, not for revenge, not for shame to fall upon him, but for courage to step into that room with my head held high and my heart steady, no matter how unsteady my legs might be. And when I finally closed my eyes, I slept not as a woman discarded, but as a woman ready to remind not just him, but myself, that dignity never leaves those who refuse to give it away. The day of the gala arrived, and from the moment I opened my eyes, I knew it would not be like any other. Because there was a stillness in me that felt like calm before a storm. Not a storm of destruction, but one of truth that would sweep into a room where I had been counted out and remind them that I was still here. My husband moved about the house in his usual rush, ironing his shirt, adjusting his tie, checking his reflection as though his image mattered more than the soul standing behind it. And not once did he look in my direction with the thought of asking if I wished him well. He assumed, as always, that I would remain behind, hidden away where my presence would not trouble him. I watched him leave, his cologne lingering in the hallway as the door closed, and instead of sadness, I felt something almost like relief, because his absence gave me the space I needed to prepare myself without his shadow pressing against me. I sat at my vanity and slowly began to dress, slipping into the silk that had been waiting for me all these years, feeling its cool fabric against my skin like a reminder of the woman I once was, a woman who had walked into grand halls with confidence and grace. My hands trembled as I fastened my necklace, but I steadied them with deep breaths, reminding myself that strength was not the absence of weakness, it was the courage to move forward despite it. I applied a soft shade of lipstick, not to hide my age, but to honor the dignity of still caring for myself. of still wanting to shine in a world that too often forgets women like me once carried entire households, entire careers, entire histories on our shoulders. When the time came, the car sent by the CEO arrived, and as I stepped outside, I felt the evening air wrap around me like a quiet embrace, cool and reassuring, reminding me that life was still waiting beyond the walls of my home. The driver opened the door with a respectful nod, and as I settled into the seat, I held my cane beside me, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a mark of the battles I had fought and survived. The ride was silent, except for the rhythm of my own heart. Each beat, reminding me that I was not just going to a gala. I was going to reclaim my place, my story, and my voice. When the car pulled up to the grand hall and the doors swung open, I paused for a moment at the entrance, gathering the last of my strength. I could hear the laughter and the music inside. I could picture him standing near the bar with his glass in hand, speaking proudly as though he alone belonged, unaware of what was about to happen. I tightened my grip on the cane, lifted my chin, and took the first step inside. And in that instant the noise softened, conversation stilled, and eyes turned toward me. Some gasped, some smiled, some whispered, but all of them looked, and for the first time in a long while I felt not invisible but fully seen. Each step I took echoed across the polished floor, steady but deliberate, and though my body trembled, my spirit did not, because I knew that this was more than a walk into a room. It was a walk back into myself, into the dignity that had been stripped from me but never destroyed. And as the CEO and his wife moved forward to greet me, their faces glowing with kindness and respect, I felt the weight of weeks of shame fall away like dust shaken from an old garment, leaving me standing not as a burden, but as a woman whose worth had never truly left her. The moment the CEO and his wife took my hands and welcomed me, I felt a warmth spread through me that no amount of illness or rejection could erase. And as they guided me further into the hall, the applause began, soft at first like a ripple moving across water, then stronger, rolling through the room until it filled every corner. And I stood there in the center of it all with tears pressing at the edge of my eyes, but my head held high. For so long, I had been made to believe that my presence was something to be hidden, something to be pitied. And yet here, among people who had known me only through whispers and memory, I was honored, seen not as broken, but as a woman who had lived, worked, and given much of herself to a world that had not always been ready for her strength. I caught sight of my husband near the bar, his face pale, his glass frozen halfway to his lips, and the sight of him standing there, suddenly small in a room that once bent to his presence, filled me not with anger but with a quiet justice, the kind that does not need raised voices or revenge, only truth made visible. The CEO spoke of my years of service, of the barriers I broke when I became the first woman in the state to manage regional operations, of the sacrifices I made that helped pave the way for others. And each word felt like a balm to wounds I had carried in silence, wounds left by the man who should have been the first to speak of me with pride. I walked with them to the head table, my cane steady against the polished floor, each step stronger than the last, because it was no longer just a movement of my body, but of my spirit rising. People I had not seen in years came forward, some with kind words, some with tears in their eyes, telling me how my story had inspired them, how they remembered my courage, and the way I carried myself with dignity, even in difficult times. And with every handshake and every embrace, I felt more of the weight I had been carrying fall away. I could feel my husband's eyes on me, restless, searching, perhaps even panicked, but I did not meet them, because this night was no longer about him. It was about me reclaiming what had been stolen in whispers and dismissals. I sat tall at the table, listening to the music play, feeling the warmth of the lights. And I thought of the countless nights I had sat alone, wondering if my life had ended the day my stroke began. But now I knew it had not ended. It had simply changed direction. And here I was, proof that even broken bodies can carry unbroken spirits. And as I lifted my glass in quiet gratitude to those who had welcomed me back into the light, I reminded myself that dignity is never given by another person. It is something you carry within you, waiting for the moment to rise again, and that night was my moment. As the evening unfolded, the CEO rose to speak again, his voice carrying across the hall with a weight that silenced every conversation, and he began to tell the story of my journey. Not the stroke that had slowed my steps, but the years of service. The walls I had broken through, when few believed a woman could lead at that level. And the steady presence I had been behind so much of the company's growth. He spoke not with pity, but with admiration, and as his words filled the room, I felt the eyes of every guest turn toward me, not with discomfort as my husband had warned, but with respect, with recognition, with a kind of warmth that seemed to lift me higher than I had stood in years. When he invited me to rise, my hand tightened on my cane. But my heart was steady, and as I stood, the room broke into applause once more, louder, longer, as if each clap was washing away a little more of the shame I had carried in silence. I looked out across the faces, some familiar, some strangers, yet all of them meeting me with a kind of reverence I had longed to feel again. And then my eyes fell briefly on my husband, standing rigid near the back, his jaw tight, his pride unraveling in front of colleagues who now saw the truth of who had been beside him all these years. He did not smile, he did not move. He simply stood there as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. And for a moment I almost pitied him, because he had built his image on the belief that I was small, and here he was watching that illusion crumble without a word from me. But I did not let my gaze linger on him, because this was not his night, it was mine. And I turned back to the CEO and the crowd with a smile that carried both gratitude and defiance. When I finally spoke, my voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of everything I had endured. I said that sometimes life changes our bodies in ways we do not choose. It slows us, it bends us, it humbles us, but it never takes away the years of strength and the legacy of what we have already built. I thank those who had remembered me not for how I walk now, but for how I lived then, and how I still choose to live. And I told them that the truest honor in life is not being perfect, but being seen for who you really are. My words were not long, but they were enough, because when I finished, the room rose to its feet, and I stood there surrounded by applause and love that filled me in places I thought would remain empty forever. It was in that moment, as the lights glowed softly and the music swelled again, that I realized I had reclaimed something far more important than a seat at a gala. I had reclaimed myself, my dignity, my worth. And no stroke, no silence, and no husband's cruel words could ever take that from me again. As I sat back down, my heart still beating with the rhythm of the applause, I felt a peace settle over me that I had not known in years, and for the first time since my stroke, I no longer felt like a shadow of who I once was. I felt whole again, as though the recognition of that room had pieced me back together in a way that medicine never could. The evening carried on with music and laughter, people coming to my table to greet me, some placing a hand over mine as they thanked me for paving the way, others sharing memories of how my work had touched their lives, and each word was like a thread weaving dignity back into the fabric of my spirit. I did not need to boast, I did not need to prove anything. I simply received their kindness with grace, letting it wash over me like sunlight after a long winter. But through it all, I could feel his eyes, my husband's eyes, following me from across the room, restless, unsettled, unable to look away, yet unable to step forward. And it struck me how small he seemed in that moment. How the man who once believed he held all the power now looked powerless in the face of truth. He shifted in his place near the bar, his shoulders tense, his smile forced when someone tried to speak to him. And I realized that his silence was no longer mine to bear. It was his burden now. The weight of knowing that the woman he tried to hide had become the very one the room honored. I did not speak to him. I did not need to. Because some lessons are not taught through words, they are taught through moments where dignity stands taller than pride. I sipped from my glass, letting the taste linger as I glanced around the hall, and I thought of all the nights I had prepared him for events like this, making sure his tie was straight, his shoes polished, his confidence intact, and yet here we were, and I had walked into the room on my own, dressed in the silk he never cared to see, carrying myself without his hand on my arm. And the truth was clear to everyone. I had not been left behind. I had risen ahead. And in that realization, I found a quiet joy. Not the joy of revenge or of seeing him suffer, but the joy of knowing that I had taken back my worth without lowering myself to his cruelty. I was seen, I was respected, and most of all, I was free. As the evening continued, I found myself surrounded by voices that lifted me higher. People who had known me in passing, and those who had only heard my name came to shake my hand, to tell me how my strength had inspired them. And every word reminded me that what my husband had tried to bury was in fact still alive in the hearts of others. The CEO's wife sat beside me for a time, holding my hand gently and telling me that the company had never forgotten my contributions, that behind every achievement of my husband's career, they had always known there was a woman standing strong. And hearing her say those words aloud brought tears to my eyes, because they were words I had longed to hear from the man himself, yet he had chosen silence. But the truth has a way of rising, and on that night it rose in a hall filled with witnesses who saw what he'd refused to see. I watched him from across the room, shifting uneasily, his pride unraveling thread by thread, as colleagues who once admired him turned their conversations toward me, their eyes lighting with respect as they spoke my name. He looked smaller with every passing hour, not because I sought to make him small, but because when truth is revealed, it shrinks falsehood on its own. I did not call him over. I did not force him to share in the glow that was never his to begin with. I simply let the room itself do the speaking, and it did so louder than I ever could. For years he had been the one introduced with honor while I stood silently at his side. But that night the roles were reversed, and he stood alone while I was the one whose presence filled the room. As I sat there, I thought back to that painful evening, when he had told me I would make people uncomfortable, that they would pity us if I attended, and I realized how wrong he had been, because no one looked at me with pity. They looked at me with admiration. They looked at me as someone who had endured and risen again. And in that reflection, I understood something vital, that often the people closest to us cannot see our worth because they are blinded by their own pride. But that does not mean the world has forgotten who we are. That night proved to me that the dignity I thought I had lost had been waiting all along, waiting for me to claim it again. And as I listened to the laughter and music around me, I felt a deep peace, the kind that no rejection, no cruel word, and no silence could ever take away again. When the night finally drew to a close, and I stepped back into the cool air outside the hall, I felt lighter than I had in months, as though the weight of every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every silence I had endured had been lifted from my shoulders, and I knew then that no matter what waited for me at home, I had already won back the part of myself that mattered most. I did not need to argue. I did not need to defend myself, because the truth had spoken for me, and it had spoken loudly in a room full of witnesses. I walked with my cane steady beside me, each step a reminder that I was still standing, still worthy, and still capable of being honored, not for what I had lost, but for all that I had given and all that I still was. That night I stopped being invisible, and I began again as someone seen. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. It means more than I can ever say. And if my words touched your heart, please subscribe and join me again, because I have more to share, and I would love to walk through these stories with you.